are you poor as an African? Everywhere you go, you are a poor African, right? That's what you've been told. And the person who has coined this thing about you being a poor African is an institution such as World Bank, which does reports and says, you as an African, a large percentage of your population lives below the poverty line. How many dollars? $2, below $2, right? Yeah. So if you live, for those who live in Nairobi, that would be, $2 would be like 230 Kenya shillings. What much can you do with 230 Kenya shillings? Very little. It's just the same way if you're in New York and you have $2, there's not so much you can do. But at the same time, the identity of the person who is poor is very African. And to contextualize this for you, I don't know, how many are here from South Africa? Yes, yes. Not Southern Africa, South Africa. One day, a while back, I was watching Oprah Winfrey because she has these interviews that she does, and also because I'm intrigued by billionaires, not because they have all that money, but because I want to know what did you do to other people to get all that money, especially after reading the fiscal world and how it works for you to be a billionaire. And she was talking about the girls' school in South Africa. And she said that one of the girls said she didn't want to be called poor. And I thought, her response would be very profound in terms of, her response to this girl. And she said, so the interviewer asked her, so what did you tell the girl? And she said, I told her, I am paying for it, so I get to tell you, you are poor. And I thought it was the most dehumanizing response ever. Because what is poverty to Africans? Poverty in a lot of our cultures never existed in terms of monetary. It existed in terms of culture, behavior, ability to help people. So for this girl, she saw herself as somebody who is of low income, but not somebody who is poor. But because somebody is giving you the money, that person gets to create the identity that you have as an African, that you are poor. So with all this, it's just to think the framing of debt within Africa also comes from a very colonial perspective. And looking at it in terms of African economies, they have the relationships they have with their former colonial masters, with quotes. For example, he talked about France. France, we know the story of France and several West African countries, which we have been calling the colonial tax, and your colonial way of keeping you always indebted to a specific country. Imagine having 50% of your reserves put in a bank in France, and then that bank in France tells you you can only get 15%, and if you want more, then you have to borrow. Already, the system is formed to ensure that you as an African remain, and your government remain in a cycle of poverty. And then the other thing we need to reflect on in terms of how the ideology of even colonial borrowing and even how we borrow as African countries. A while back, a lot of African countries were looking to countries in Europe, Americas. But also there was something happening within our own institutions and all that. I remember at that time, Karl Marx was the person who we would quote when we are talking about economy and how capitalism and versus all that. But have you noticed since we shifted to China, a lot of our politicians are obsessed with the politics of Mao Zedong. So everywhere you go, somebody is quoting Mao Zedong. I remember there's a joke in Kenya whereby during the time when I was a kid, there was a lot of uprising in the universities. And apparently the joke is that the former President Moi asked, why is it that all these students are rioting and making so much noise? And somebody told him, it's because they are reading and listening to Karl Marx. And he said, go arrest Karl Marx and bring him here. So you can see a visual of how we operate in terms of our thinking, in terms of the direction we are taking as Africans when it comes to debt, but then also looking at now where we are as a continent. Because our colonial, the colonial countries, that is the France, the European countries, they would give money but also give it with conditions. And then African leaders said, we don't want to be asked how we are doing in terms of human rights before we get money. And we are in need of infrastructure, so they moved to China. And when they moved to China, you could see the global shift and also the fear. So China organizes a meetings, calls African leaders to talk about, development in Africa. Then America and UK are asking, what is China doing in Africa? Why is it that they are so angry that China is in Africa? And at the same time, my question is, African countries, our leaders, are they part of that conversation? Or it's China and the UK asking what is China doing in Africa, but also African countries are just there. They are part of the chessboard. They are being moved within a bigger picture of what is happening across the global and geopolitics. So I want to contextualize debt in terms of what has happened actually in the context of COVID. I don't have a presentation, I just have notes, and I think the afternoon is too much for presentations. So if you look at COVID, when it started, already we had had a lot of conversations around debt across the continent in terms of we felt some countries are in distress, countries like Sierra Leone, countries like Mauritania. There was a bit of worry that the kind of debt that African countries have taken on is not sustainable, and a lot of them would not be able to repay back the loan. But also what was in the air is in terms of what was the leverage from the people who lend from African countries. So there are conversations around ports will be taken. There are conversations around, certain parts of the government will be operated by Chinese and all that. But also at the heart of that is when COVID hit, a lot of African governments were not prepared. And what that did is that we now got into a situation in a panic mood, where we are trying to get monies to solve basic issues around health, to be able to mitigate and all that. So there are all those monies that have been mentioned in terms of what African countries were given, in terms of austerity measures and, trying to cushion you from COVID. But the truth is, there's also how debt is managed within our own countries. I don't know about your different countries, but in Kenya there was a major scandal around COVID supplies in terms of health. Did this happen in your countries? Yeah. So this money that was given to caution and to shield has gone to the pockets of people who wants to give a tender, and then all things were quoted at, I think 3 or sometimes 3-4 times the price of the original products. So already with that situation, now African governments found themselves in this situation where we are closing economies. A lot of things have happened. We are not able to respond to these things. Then came the vaccine inequality. And the vaccine inequality is whereby countries from global north decided they are going to hoard and keep the vaccines to themselves, and so there are no vaccines to African countries. So you had countries like Canada, who have a population of around, I think, is it 20 million? But they have like 40 million of the COVID vaccines. At the same time, African countries are saying we can buy. But people don't want you to buy. They want to give you as charity. Why is it that people want to give you your medicine, this medicine that you want to buy as charity? It's because they get to negotiate with you. For example, I remember just before Uganda got their first batch of COVID-19 vaccines, I think there was something happening. I think it was a negotiation for refugees. And they were asked if they would take, remember, Uganda is one of the countries with the highest numbers of refugees, the country that is hosting quite a large number of refugees. So Uganda accepted, yes, we'll take in a few more refugees. And the next week, there was an announcement that COVID vaccines are heading to Uganda. Then in terms of the two institutions that have been spoken about, the IMF and the World Bank. You know, at that time, there was a lot of borrowing, and I remember that time when World Bank just recently gave the Kenyan government around, is it 800 billion or something like that? And somebody on Twitter asked, so they just wake up and give him the money? And I'm like, yes, because the entire existence of these organizations is to give low-income countries money, and they keep them in the system that was described. So yes, if he wants loans, he will get the loans. And also, he doesn't have to account for it. I mean, he's getting out this year, hopefully. So it's not a big thing for him. So there are all these institutions, then they come in and they tell African countries, now that you're trying to rebuild your economies, we will help you, redo that. And I don't want to delve into the politics of that because there were a lot of examples that were given around how that has happened across different countries, how these negotiations have been done. But then, when you look at that, now the consequence, we can begin to feel them as citizens. And that maybe is where now I will concentrate my presentation on, especially in terms of what really is the true cost of the debt crisis that we have in the African continent. So Oxfam is known as the inequality organizations. We always do these huge reports we call the inequality index reports, where we talk about, the states of inequality. So this year we have already launched one for West Africa, another one for Southern Africa, and recently we launched one for the East Africa. But also there's a larger report that, looks at just the global undertakings around inequality. And the current one, the title is Inequality Kills. You can check it out and see what is the take of Oxfam in terms of inequality. But then looking at Africa and the implications then now of these austerity measures, I don't know if you have begun seeing something happening within the universities. Anything that has happened in the universities in your country? Somebody can just raise their hand and tell me. Yes.
Il y a l'explosion des effectifs.
Come again?
Il y a l'explosion des effectifs dans un premier temps. Moi, c'est ce que j'ai constaté dans un premier temps dans les universités sénégalaises.
Any other country that wants to give an example? Yes.
Bon, chez nous, par exemple, au Mali, on n'arrive plus à achever les années universitaires. Je ne sais pas comment l'expliquer. Vous allez trouver qu'il y a des enfants qui ont fait le bac il y a 3 ou 4 ans, qui devaient peut-être terminer leur cursus au bout de 3 ou 4 ans, mais ils sont encore à l'université 5 ans après et ils n'arrivent pas à terminer leur cursus. Voilà un peu un problème très sérieux que nous on vit au niveau du Mali actuellement.
Je voulais dire que c'est aussi le cas au niveau de l'université de Dakar. Il y a des étudiants de l'année 2020-2021 qui sont encore en train de finir cette année scolaire-là au niveau de cette année 2022.
Yeah, so I think also this is similar to Kenya. And one of the things that we have observed is that if you see the kind of measures that the universities are taking, for example, in the Kenyan universities, fees has gone up 3 times what it was. So there are those students who used to be in public system, which is paid through the HELB loan. So they are no longer able to go back because their parents cannot be able to take up the triple the fees that the universities have introduced. So, and maybe that also could be explained in some of these other countries where students are still at home but have not resumed school. The other thing is that the implication of it in terms of education is that it's not just the university. Remember, since independence, the largest population of educated Africans is existing in this generation. It's where we are having a very large population of Africans who have gone through education. Now, what is going to happen is that we need to be careful not to go back to where we were before, where African countries took advice from IMF and all these other institutions. And the institutions that actually died, lost funding, were the universities. And there was an implication in terms of knowledge production, in terms of the level of education, in terms of across gender, across age groups, because of austerity measures. So what we are witnessing is something that it's history repeating itself. Then if you look at other things like healthcare, for a lot of Africans, you access healthcare through the work that you do. It's very rare to find, it's only the privileged people in our populations that are able to take healthcare through the, personal insurance and all that. Most people access their health insurance through employment. So here you are, COVID has happened, people have lost their jobs. What has happened to healthcare? People do not have access to healthcare. They cannot afford the cost of healthcare. And then because government have taken austerity measures, means they have added a lot of taxation on a lot of things. And therefore, it's really difficult for the normal, citizen of Africa to be able to get money out of their pockets to be able to pay directly for healthcare. So the implication here is that we are going to witness a decline in healthcare. And if you, as journalists, are investigating, there is the Abuja Declaration where countries, African countries, agreed they are going to fund 15% of their budgets on health. Now, if over 30% of your budget is going back to repaying loans, will you be able to put 15% to healthcare? And then also, there's the investment on agriculture, which is supposed to be around 10%. African countries are not able to do that because why? A large percentage of this money they are heavily taxing you on still goes back to paying the debt, the loans that they had taken, and now they are unable to pay or they are struggling to pay. Then the other thing this year is AU Year of Nutrition. And I've spoken a little bit about the CADIP, which is called the Commitment on the Comprehensive Agricultural Development Program, which of course governments say 10% of our budget will go to, nutrition, will go to funding agriculture and all that. I have seen a lot of social media campaigns around food prices must go down. Food prices will not go down if you are taxing double the money on the fertilizer that the farmer is using. If you are taxing double the fuel cost that the farmer is using to get their food from the farm to the market, food prices will not fall. For example, in some countries where actually the oil prices have gone up, and I find this very interesting. I don't know if they have started telling you in your countries that the reason why things are so bad is because of Russia and Ukraine. Yeah. So countries had economies not working since before COVID. So COVID just made it worse. Now we have shifted from COVID. We are like, this crisis is because of Russia and Ukraine. No, it's not. The reason why we are having high prices in fuel is because more than 60% of the percentage I'm paying for a liter is going to taxes. And then the double taxation, because still government is really trying hard to get money to repay the loans that they took. So you find I will pay my taxes through the payee, where as an employee, you're supposed to give some tax to the government. Then from there, I'll go to the shop, I'll buy food, I'm taxed on that food. The Uber driver who I take me to the market will also, after I pay him, he will be taxed that money, and then also Uber will take 25% from that driver. Yeah? So this is the human cost in terms of how African countries are struggling with the debt. It all comes down to it's like being in the water and you're drowning, and so you're doing everything. They're like this, under the water. You're seeing them doing speeches from here, but under the water, they're really struggling to survive because of the debts that we have taken over the period of time. And I think I don't want to go through that because I feel he really contextualized in terms of how those debts are received by African countries. Then something I found quite interesting. As I mentioned, this year was the year of nutrition. This is the year of nutrition for African Union. But do you know in the AU summit that happened in January, African leaders did not discuss a lot about nutrition. They discussed Palestine and Israel, and they also discussed the rise of conflict and militarization. And they immediately developed like a protocol, yeah, that says, as African countries, we are not going to stand, with militarization, and where we have coup d'etats and leaders who have been voted constitutionally being removed. Why do you think that is happening? Because they are anticipating a certain uprising within the African populace because of how hard life has become for Africans. If you look at 2020, we only had one coup in 2020. In 2021, we had 4 coups. And we are not even in March. How many coups have we had in the African continent? I think they're around 2 or 3. So already they understand the implication of the fact that the economy is so bad and the fact that people are not happy, they are struggling, they don't have money in their pockets, they are struggling to move from meal to meal. That is so well understood to them. That's why the biggest discussion in the African Union meeting was around how do we stop this rise of military takeovers and all that. But also something is in it, because in some of these countries where there were military takeovers, the citizens actually supported it. There were countries where citizens supported it, right? So the implication of that is that they're already nervous, that you as the African citizens, there's a way you're organizing around it, there's a way their presence, their existence within the structure of governance is really threatened. So looking at that in terms of how we exist as Africans and how we are interacting with each other, if we are meeting at the African Union and the first conversation we're having is around Israel and Palestine, nothing about the life of the African citizen. It's something I think can be interrogated further. And when I tried to watch across the media stations just to see what analysis was done around the AU meeting, there was not so much that was done in terms of trying to dissect what the African leaders discussed. And in a way, I think that also is because it's by design. Because for those of us who engage with the African Union, we know the civic space and engagement of even journalists has shrunk. You cannot engage, you cannot be in the same room, you cannot listen to the conversation. And this was not the case before sadly, Dr. Lamini Zuma came in, because she's the one who swept away the civic space where we are able to engage with the African Union and be able to challenge some sort of thinking that African leaders are directing Africans towards. And also thinking of it in terms of the Chinese company that is giving loans to African countries is able to access the African Union. The American diplomat who will want to have some kind of negotiations with your government can access the African Union, but you as a journalist, me as a civil society actor, I'm not able to access that. It's by design. The whole thing around how the negotiations are done is by design. It's supposed to keep us in a situation where the North continues to grow and Africa remains poor. So as I finish, I ask you again, why are you a poor African? Who said you are a poor African? Whose identity is the word poor premised on? Who has given us that identity? Because it's not our identity. It's not something that we have coined as Africans. It's a system that is created to portray and to keep us poor.
You and I are the people to hold our governments to